Jackie Zipkin is the general manager of EBDA, the East Bay Dischargers Authority, representing the cities of Hayward and San Leandro and the Loma, Union, and Castro Valley sanitary districts. Also, they contract with Livermore-Amador Valley Water Management Agency. EBDA basically maintains the pipe, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, that's NPDES if you're scoring at home. That permit, which is the main permit, the main mechanism for the health of the Bay, which is governed by the Bay Area Water Board. And so that is the discharge permit to the Bay. And she is here with us today to talk about transformative shoreline projects. Okay. So I will get out of the way and let you go, Jackie.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. So I'm going to talk, the title I was giving is Transforming East Bay Shorelines. I'm going to talk mainly about the area we refer to as the Hayward shoreline, which goes basically from San Leandro south to Highway 92. So I'll talk a little bit about what's happening there on that macro scale, and then I'm going to focus in on one specific project that I've been working on, which is called the First Mile Horizontal Levee. And that project will eventually transform this particular marsh here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. That is referred to as Loma Marsh, and it's an East Bay Parks area just south of the Loma Sanitary District Treatment Plant, which is right here, which is where I'm sitting today. So the challenge, and this is a challenge I'm sure you will be hearing about a lot over the course of the next 2 days, among others, with 2 feet of sea level rise in this particular area, along with 100-year storm surge, most of the Hayward shoreline is inundated. And so this is an image from a master plan that I'm going to talk a little bit about that was done a few years ago, showing basically everything except the former landfill is underwater. And so how are we going to transform this landscape in order to protect it for recreation, for habitat, and for the communities that lie behind it? So the approach that we're taking in the Hayward area is a collaborative one. The Hayward Area Shoreline Planning Agency, or HASPA, which I'll touch on a little bit more in the next slide, developed in 2021 a Hayward Area Shoreline Adaptation Master Plan. So this master plan lays out a series of projects based on stakeholder feedback that link together to protect the Hayward shoreline and adapt it for sea level rise into the future. So there's a link to the Hayward Area Shoreline Adaptation Master Plan. I encourage folks to take a look. I think it presents an interesting model for collaborative decision-making and thinking about an area of shoreline as a system. So as I mentioned, this area covered by the master plan goes from basically from San Lorenzo. So this is the Loma site up here, south to Highway 92. And the master plan was adopted by the Hayward Area Shoreline Planning Agency in 2021. That is an agency that is a joint powers authority of the City of Hayward, East Bay Regional Park District, Hayward Area Recreation District, and recently added the Alameda County Mosquito Abatement District. So those agencies collaboratively developed this master plan, working with many other agencies, including EBDA and our members. The master plan was supported by a Caltrans grant, and it includes an ambitious program of 20 capital projects, 2 of which are underway now. One is the Hayward Marsh Restoration that's in this area here, that's being led by East Bay Parks. And then the first mile horizontal levee, which is going to be the focus of the remainder of my talk. But we know that around the bay, this challenge is going to be expensive, and the estimate for the projects laid out in this master plan was about $1 billion, and that's in 2021 dollars. So we know nothing's getting cheaper, although the opportunity to reuse dredge sediment certainly could help because a lot of the cost relates to fill. So we have been lucky enough to receive grant funding from EPA Region 9's Water Quality Improvement Fund to move the ideas in this master plan forward. And so this grant is kicking off now. And the scope includes a few things. One is an implementation plan for that HASPA master plan. So we have the master plan, we have the projects laid out, but how would we sequence them? Who would lead each project? How would they be financed? How would they be permitted? And does it make sense to bundle some of them together for permitting and or for CEQA? So those are the questions that the implementation plan is going to explore, and that project's going to be led by East Bay Parks. Another project that's going to be moving in parallel with that, also led by East Bay Parks, is a HASPA governance strategy. So HASPA, as I mentioned, is a JPA, but there's an interest in looking at whether that's the right model moving forward to implement the master plan and beyond, or does it make sense, for example, to move toward a model that is being employed in San Mateo County by One Shoreline. And I think you'll be hearing from their CEO later on this program, but they've combined what was a flood control district and the cities in their county into a new special district specifically focused on sea level rise adaptation and stormwater management. And so that's one model that is going to be explored through this governance strategy. Another question that the governance strategy will explore is who's going to lead which projects and how. That's where it sort of intersects with the master plan. So as you'll hear me talk about as we get further into this presentation, EBDA has been leading the first mile horizontal levee project, but we are probably not the right entity to build it. As Dennis described, we're responsible for pumps, pipes, and permit. When it comes to wastewater, we don't really maintain flood control infrastructure or recreational infrastructure or habitat. And so those are the benefits that the first mile will provide. And it probably makes sense for either East Bay Parks to implement the project or for HASPA to implement the project. And so thinking about the governance with relation to how these projects will be developed and maintained is another element of that governance strategy. We're also going to be doing pretty extensive community engagement. There was extensive community engagement as part of or stakeholder engagement, I would say, as part of the master plan, but not really direct public engagement. And so that's going to be this next phase, is really reaching out to the community to see how they want to interact with these projects. And then this grant is also going to fund about $1.2 million for continuing the design and permitting to get this first mile horizontal levee project that I'll be talking about to a state of really being shovel ready. So that's completing the design, CEQA, and permitting. So what is a horizontal levee? Some of you may have seen me or others present this before, but wanted to set the stage for what it is that we're talking about with this specific project and what the opportunity is. And this concept is being replicated in various places around the bay and even in a couple spots along the Hayward shoreline. But the idea is that conventional levees and seawalls use a lot of concrete and a lot of riprap to basically protect the communities behind them from nature in terms of sea and storm surge. Using a horizontal levee, we shrink the concrete and the height of that levee core, and then provide a gentle slope down toward the water's edge that provides habitat. It allows the the sediment to accrete over time and sort of adaptively grow as sea level rises. And then in the subsurface, we can provide a treatment layer that provides a lot of benefit in terms of water quality improvement when we put contaminated water, such as treated wastewater or stormwater or reverse osmosis concentrate, through that layer. It provides treatment. So we have the existing levee, then native vegetation on top, a water treatment layer, as I described, and then that provides ecosystem services like habitat for native species, climate change adaptation, and improvements to water quality. So moving on, where has this been demonstrated? Well, we are lucky to have a test bed right here at Loma. And if any of you all on the line are interested in touring this facility at some point, I love taking people out there and showing them what's been accomplished. And I think you have a talk perhaps later today from Dr. David Sedlak, who's really been the visionary behind this concept in terms of exploring the water quality benefits of a horizontal levee. But this is a feature now of the Loma wastewater treatment plant, which is what you see on the screen. And it was developed to, and this is where we are around the bay, and an early shot of the demonstration site. It was developed to test this concept of a gently sloping natural feature planted with native vegetation with a water quality treatment subsurface layer. So because it is an experimental site, it was developed with 12 independent cells, each of which had a slightly different substrate, each of which had slightly different planting regime. And the team at UC Berkeley, Dr. Sedlak and his students, have been evaluating if you put wastewater into the treatment zone, how does it perform in terms of providing additional treatment? And what we're talking about here, at least at the outset, was secondary treated wastewater. So this is wastewater that's already clean enough to go to the bay. But historically, we haven't had requirements to discharge to the bay when it comes to nutrients like nitrogen, or when it comes to pharmaceuticals, pesticides, other emerging contaminants that aren't yet regulated. And so that's been the focus of this research, is in treating those contaminants, particularly nutrients, are now required to be removed over the next 10 years by wastewater treatment plants to prevent algal blooms like the one we saw in 2022. So the water influent at the top end, effluent at the bottom end. And the researchers have found that the horizontal levee is highly effective at removing nitrogen. So this is an exciting finding in terms of the benefit for water quality that I was talking about. You can see this is distance along the slope, and within just the first couple feet, the nitrate is basically removed. Also, they found that it's really effective at removing trace organics like pharmaceuticals that otherwise are now discharged to the bay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of the time on these slides. There's some great papers that have been published by Dr. Sedlak's students that can be referenced if folks are interested. Once those findings were becoming clear, there was an interest in testing other things. And so the team ripped out several of the cells, and they're now testing a steeper slope, since we know that a lot of the removal happened just in the first few feet. They're testing treatment zone thickness, like, do we need such a thick layer, or could it be thinner? Could it be different constituents? And then what's gotten a lot of attention in recent years is, as an emerging set of contaminants, is polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. And so they're testing several subsurface additives that can be used to remove PFAS from the wastewater. So scaling up that concept, that's all well and good at this little postage stamp sized experiment, but how do we actually transform our shoreline using this approach? And so that's what the first mile project has been about. As I mentioned, it's immediately south of the Loma treatment plant, so just a few steps away from the demonstration site. And it's approximately a mile in length, so that's why we call it the first mile. The concept here is that we would have what we're calling an ecotone levee along a portion of the slope. That means it has that gentle slope, but it doesn't have the wastewater treatment component. Then the horizontal levee, which includes that treatment layer along a portion. And then we're preserving some natural ecotone. We're making some improvements to the creek, basically to improve the functionality of this system, natural system, into the future with sea level rise. So, going back to the concepts of, well, what would it look like to have a traditional levee and riprap? This is sort of what looking from the bay east into this community along the Bachman Canal, this is what it could look like during storm conditions if we went with the traditional model. And then this is a transformed landscape, and obviously we have a nicer day that we're looking at in this image, but it's looking the same direction and thinking about what sort of natural and recreational amenities can be provided if we take this horizontal levee approach as opposed to a traditional levee with riprap. So the goals of the First Mile project are to implement a full-scale demonstration of the horizontal levee concept, contribute to reducing current and future flood risk for the HASPA planning area, enhance habitat for special species and native wetland dependent species, make existing habitats more resilient to sea level rise, provide public access to the Hayward regional shoreline, which this site currently doesn't have any public access, support recreational and social benefits to nearby communities, and improve water quality for San Francisco Bay. So we're trying to accomplish a lot with this one project. And one of the things that we are realizing the further we get into it is that there are trade-offs among these. When you have a multi-benefit project, all benefits aren't necessarily equal. You can't necessarily get everything in one project. And so we're making decisions on how to balance these various priorities and goals. One of the challenges that we have on this particular site is that we are site constrained. So this is a land use map of that same area we've been looking at, and you can see that we are boxed in by flood control channels to the north and south, and the Union Pacific Capital Corridor Railway to the east. And that's important because when we're talking about raising this area of shoreline in order to protect the habitat and the communities from future flooding, that means placing fill on an existing wetland. And so the natural tendency from the natural response from the regulators in early conversations was, well, can't you just push it back so that it's not in the existing wetland? We don't want to place fill on an existing wetland, but really we can't go back. So we're trying to think creatively about both how to design this in a way that minimizes near-term impacts to the wetland, as well as just permitting wise, how do we creatively think about that? In terms of long-term sea level rise adaptation, another important element of this is how does it connect to the rest of, to the north and south in terms of flood protection. And that's something that it was a real benefit of the master plan in terms of thinking about what is the line of protection going from north to south? How do we connect these projects? One of our challenges on this project is we have right now we don't connect to anything, actually. The line of protection in the master plan does continue south, but right now we just have this gap at the railroad embankment where we need to either get over or under somehow in order to continue that line of protection. Otherwise, we can have this great levee here, but the water is just going to go right up the channel here and flood the railway. So we're going to, in the future, need increased collaboration with the railroad as well as with the flood control district. Some of the permitting considerations. So I should say, and I have a slide on the status later, but we're at 30% design on this project now. That was funded through prior EPA funds, and we're just about to start that next phase of design. And so as we've been developing the 30% design, we've been in consultation with the BRIT, the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. So the various agencies that are engaged in permitting restoration projects along the shoreline. And so we've been talking through these challenges and issues and using that to inform our design process. So one of the big questions is, what is the baseline? This is a project where we're trying to save habitat from future conditions, and our regulations aren't really well set up for that. To be placing fill on an existing good quality wetland in order to protect the species that are there and the habitat from future inundation. And so that's been a big point of conversation, is how do we consider future sea level rise when we're looking at wetland impacts and species impacts? Also, we're talking about habitat type conversion, from temporarily from a marsh condition to an upland condition, and then eventually it will revert back to a marsh. And so how do we think about those temporal aspects? Protected species considerations I kind of touched on, and then NPDES permitting. Dennis spelled out earlier what that means, but basically, if we're going to be putting treated wastewater out into the environment in a different place than we currently are, which is way out into the center of the bay, then we're going to need new permits for that. And what do those look like? So this just shows, flipping back and forth, these are the current habitats, and then this is what the habitats will look like with the horizontal levee. And so that's been kind of the basis for these conversations. I talked a little bit about trade-offs, and I wanted to show just one example. We talked about the need to minimize fill on the existing wetland, and the way to do that is to make this slope narrower, right? If we have this gentle slope going out into the marsh, if we make it steeper and narrower, then we have less fill and less impact to the existing marsh. But if we are going to employ the treatment zone and try to get these water quality benefits, then we need a longer runway. It needs to be a shallower slope in order to incorporate that subsurface treatment layer. And so those are the trade-offs. We've in working through this process, we've actually shortened the length of the horizontal levee portion, which means we'll be getting less wastewater treatment out of this project in order to minimize the near-term habitat impacts. And so that's a trade-off that is being made in order to kind of get this project built, and an example of how we trade off some of these competing goals. So this is where we've been and where we're going with the First Mile project. I mentioned the HASPA master plan that was developed in 2021. Since then, we've been developing the conceptual design, meeting with the BRIT, taking the BRIT out to the site so they could see some of the constraints that we're working with, developing grant applications for the next phase, then finalizing the design and cost estimate. And now we are here, and we are, I'm taking to EBDA's commission next month, or this month, a funding agreement for the grant funds for the next phase, and that will allow us to get a consultant on board to take this forward starting next January, into all of this work: geotech, 60% design, CEQA permitting, 90% design, et cetera, over the next few years. So in conclusion, there's a huge opportunity with projects like this to achieve multiple benefits, but multiple objectives leads to multiple trade-offs, as I touched on. Community benefits is an area that we're going to be paying increased attention to in this next phase. The image here is one example of a community benefit that we may explore for this project. This isn't currently part of it, but I mentioned that we don't have any public access to this site currently. And there's a really beautiful community park just on the other side of the railway. So how do we build that connection? Maybe it's a bridge over the railroad, for example, that connects public transit and pedestrians using this park to this beautiful new area that we're developing. So that's just an example. Nothing's been decided on that, but something we're going to be thinking about. It's important to get all key stakeholders to the table. And in our case, I mentioned critically in this next phase, we're going to be engaging with the flood control district and the railroad, neither of which have been reliably at the table in the work done to date. And we need to get their input if we're going to actually build this thing. And then the HASPA vision and planning process that I mentioned will help define the implementation approach for this project. Basically, who's going to build it, with what funding, and how are we linking it to other projects. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Jackie. Yeah, again, very interesting to see how the planning process is going. It always strikes me how developed and populated the areas are to the east, and then to have this wetlands right, next door. It's on the other side of the tracks.
Right.
Quite something. You mentioned the quotable quote, multi-benefits lead to multi-trade-offs.
Yeah.
It's a long bumper sticker, but
I'll need to workshop
I
that
think
one.
that's certainly worth mentioning. And it's exciting about horizontal levees. I mean, there's also a smaller horizontal levee afoot in Palo Alto that
Right.
are kind of interested in it. I think it doesn't have some of the issues, like a railway.
Right. Yeah, they've had their own challenges, and I should have mentioned that. But yeah, they are Palo Alto project is a little bit ahead of us, and we're working closely with them to learn from their process. That project is permitted and ready to build. And so we're definitely going to be learning a lot from that. It is smaller, but that will actually be the first horizontal levee that connects to the bay. So that's a really exciting milestone.
Well, thanks again. I see a number. Well, there was a question about where about the Palo Alto project, and perhaps you could link in the chat maybe some info about that.
Sure. Yeah.
And there was a question too in the chat. What do you believe has led to the recent push for more beneficial uses, leading to community access, bettering landscapes for the public? One thing I just want to throw in my 2 cents. It's interesting. I'm scheduled the next week to interview 2 long-term elected officials, Jim Bell tomorrow and Joe Samidian, and next week for Exergy TV. And the thing that strikes me is their academic background is they are urban planners. And they are used to long-term thinking and balancing benefits and the financing of said things, because the whole issue with multi-benefits is getting over the fact that one department budget is affected, and the positive impacts affect a number of budgets. So anyway, I'll let you take a swing at that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think there's just been a recognition that if we're going to be investing billions of dollars along our shoreline, let's try to do that in a way that's equitable, in a way that brings community members into the process. I'm not sure exactly what lit the spark there, but I definitely see that as a trend. And, we're really excited in the next phase of work. I didn't get into it in detail, but one of the partners that we've engaged is an organization called Teach Earth Action, which is a nonprofit based out of Chabot College in Hayward, where there are community college instructors who engage their students in action learning. And that's going to be a really cool tool for us to really get out into the community, because those students know the heartbeat of their community. They have their connections, and allowing them to bring folks into the conversation, I think, is going to be really exciting. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of positive energy. And the other thing I'll say is that our partners on this project, this is an East Bay Regional Parks site. So this particular site has not had public access, but that is part of their mission. And right now, the public access along Loma Marsh is at the bay's edge. That's where the Bay Trail goes. But one of the things that the master plan looked at is, how does the Bay Trail adapt with sea level rise? And so the idea is that the Bay Trail will migrate inland as sea level rises, and will be integrated with this project. So I think, it's always been part of the mission for East Bay Parks, for Hayward Area Recreation District, to have public access and public engagement. And now we are building these partnerships to find these multiple benefit opportunities.
Okay, fine. Well, bonus round, one last question about how reliable are the estimates for the timing and amount of sea level rise? What if it's higher and sooner than expected?
Yeah, good question. Timing is a question. So, we know it's going to get high, and the question is just when. So I intentionally didn't have a timeline on that slide where I showed the sea level rise estimates, because the estimates aren't changing. It's just getting sooner, right?
Yeah.
We are building this to a certain height that allows it to link to what's north and south of it. But and to minimize the amount of fill again in the near term, but we are building it in a way that has an adaptation pathway, meaning that it could be raised and broadened in the future. So that's our strategy, is basically build for the next few decades, and then see what's needed after that.
Yeah, and certainly there's along with this kind of, say, thinking, in terms of adaptive use and just all these good planning things. It's, in a way, it's great. It's just great to see that it's makes so much sense. So basically, a move towards common sense and good in long-range planning is a good move. And certainly, it is great also to hear about the Army Corps and essentially the circular economy or circular economic aspects of their dredge material. Because of the shorelines really need it. And so, back in the day, they used to dump everything out around the Farallon Islands, which was, among other things, was really expensive. So it's good that they're, it's just so refreshing to hear.